Do you want to know what's happening in the Finger Lakes? We do too. We're going in depth with decision makers in the heart of upstate New York to get the answers you need. From the team of FingerLakes1.com, this is Inside the FLX.
Today on the show, we're talking with first responders about the state of EMS in the Finger Lakes. A few years ago, I was joined by Matthew Sproul from Canandaigua Emergency Squad on Inside the FLX to talk about the challenges his department was facing at the time. That was before the pandemic, skyrocketing inflation, and a continued decline in volunteerism. That situation hasn't improved. Recent data shows volunteer forces are down 50 to 70% across upstate New York. Rural departments are facing the greatest challenge, not only posed by manpower issues, but challenges in collecting payments for services rendered. It's complicated stuff. And last week, I was joined by Chief Sproul and Canandaigua Emergency Squad's Deputy Chief of Administration, David Hubble, to get an update on how things are in their world. Check it out.
Dr. Jeffrey Halstead has been Canandaigua's hometown dentist for more than 35 years, offering routine dental care as well as cosmetic dentistry, implants, and dentures by their highly trained and experienced staff. Visit them online at canandaiguadentistry.com or find them on Facebook and Instagram.
I'm curious, when you guys working in this every day, when you zoom out and you just sort of look across the board at EMS services, what stands out to you as some of the bigger issues that you guys are dealing with day in and day out?
Probably looking at the bigger picture, I think the issues that we're having day in and day out from all the EMS agencies across the state is probably staffing issues, not having enough EMTs or paramedics available to help those who are in need. We have the pandemic, most of the colleges closed down, so the EMT and paramedic courses, for the most part, stopped during that time, which left probably a good 2-year gap between having more providers come into the workforce. On the same token, we have a very aging population of experienced providers who are retiring and leaving the EMS field, which leaves quite a bit of openings for new EMTs and paramedics to fill the shoes.
Yeah. And obviously every year it seems during the legislative cycle in Albany, we hear elected officials talk a lot about the staffing crisis that a lot of especially volunteer forces are dealing with. Have we seen any positive tidbits coming in that side? Is it easier to recruit now than maybe it was 3 or 4 years ago? Or is it still sort of the same challenges that you guys were dealing with, 3, 4, 5 years ago and maybe 10 years ago too?
I think especially in a volunteer setting, the challenges actually have increased. The amount of, and not to get into politics stuff, but the inflation, the amount of cost there is of living. People just don't have enough time to volunteer as they used to help their communities. They're picking up 2 or 3 different jobs just to afford to live, which decreases their opportunity to volunteer and help. Yeah.
I recall from our last conversation, one of the things that stood out to me was the complexity and challenge around the dollars and cents of, for example, reimbursements. Have we seen improvement in that, or is that still a big challenge for EMS forces in terms of recouping some of the money that is going out when you guys provide services day in, day out?
I think that's an extreme, huge challenge that we're still having. There were some positive things in legislation to where New York State has passed a ruling that some insurance companies have to send the checks to the agencies who provided care instead of the patients. Unfortunately, legislation also put that doesn't start until 2025. So we still have gone another year or two without receiving those checks. And a lot of patients continue to collect those checks and not move them forward to where it was supposed to go, which has affected a lot of agencies as of late. The other hard part was reimbursements is the models don't work that people gave. Medicare and Medicaid have not increased along with inflation. So equipment and supplies has quadrupled in cost, but yet reimbursement has pretty much stayed the same as 10 years ago. A good example of this, 3 years ago, we could buy an ambulance for $132,000. That same ambulance now is $182,000. So 3 years time, as just a quick example, because everybody has different monies in mind, some reimbursements have literally just stayed the same. So if you take care of somebody and you're paid $105, then you're still paid $105. The insurances will only pay what the insurances have decided to pay, not what you bill.
Right. In terms of the day-to-day, I would imagine that creates a pinch from a budget standpoint throughout the year. So like, how is that managed month to month, year to year for departments like yours?
So departments like mine are departments who do not receive any tax funding whatsoever, $0 from the taxpayers. That in itself, we still have to pay wages to the career staff. We have to pay for the fuel, electric, gas, supplies, and equipment. With that being said, we are the only business that, even upon services rendered, we don't know if we're getting paid. We hope, but it literally is a hope. We may be paid a year or two down the road for that. Not many businesses could survive in that aspect. Think of a pizza place. If you ordered a pizza, you picked up the pizza and you don't pay for that pizza, you decide what you're going to pay, how you're going to pay, and when you're going to pay. The pizza place probably won't remain open for very long. But yet ambulances continue to be there and run that same model approach. We hope we're getting paid, and many times we don't.
So then the natural follow-up to that is, for anybody listening or watching, they're thinking to themselves, well, how do they do it then? Where does the money come from when the year ends and say 25% of the folks who've used services haven't actually paid, or you haven't been reimbursed for those 25%? Like, how does the book balance at the end of the year?
We do a lot of work trying to help find for grants to buy equipment and help purchase supplies. The other thing we depend heavily upon is donations. I know in 2024, that's weird sounding. Everybody thinks of police, fire, and EMS. It's an essential service, but even today in New York, EMS is not essential. There is nothing that says if you call 911, you should have an ambulance. It is not rated as an essential service at this time. Fire and police are, but not EMS. That being said, donations are dwindling, and grants are getting harder and harder to get because everybody's fighting for donations and the same grants. That's where EMS is struggling. Part of that struggle in trying to balance the books is EMTs and paramedics, in my opinion, are not earning a livable wage. That is another reason why many people don't take it as a career, because they have to do literally about 2 to 3 jobs just to survive in EMS.
Yeah. For those who don't know, walk us through what the structure is. I know we were talking right before we came on here about you guys having a nice blend of career, volunteer, a lot of different walks of life, helping you guys out and working day to day. So walk us through how Canandaigua Emergency Squad is sort of operated day to day.
So Canandaigua Emergency Squad has 3 ambulance bases. We have a Naples ambulance base, we have an East Bloomfield ambulance division, and we have the main division in Canandaigua right in the city. The main division has about 4 to 5 ambulances up during the day. Majority of it is career staff. We do that to ensure an ambulance can go to take care of any 911 calls that come out. Our Naples and East Bloomfield division is mainly set up with volunteers. when the volunteers are able to help, they go on the schedule, they come into service and they help. When they're not available, we actually will supply an EMT, a career EMT in their place. And this just ensures that people have EMS coverage around the clock in our area.
Yeah. In terms of that, the challenge you were just talking about before is sort of the operational dollars and cents challenge. How do you balance that with the fact that you're continuing to grow in terms of coverage area? That seems like when you have those two things sort of running against each other, that there would be a sort of doomsday scenario looming where, you're having to cover such a large area that, the funding just can't match it.
It is a scenario that many EMS agencies are discussing day by day, week by week. We have been for the last probably, I would say, 6 to 8 years. We see the concept coming to where at some point we may have to depend on tax dollars just in order to make sure there's an ambulance available. That being said, I think there's always a time where you have to remain vigilant about budgeting, about where to put your personnel and equipment. I don't think there's any perfect answer to it all, but something has to change in the future, or EMS agencies across the state are going to dwindle to where they're not going to be able to keep running in business.
In terms of coverage area, what are we talking about in terms of drive time from, say, corner to corner or end to end for folks who maybe haven't made that drive from Canandaigua to Naples to the very western portion of Ontario County where East Bloomfield is? Like, what is sort of the lay of the land as far as that goes?
For our area that we take care of?
Yeah. So
Naples is a drive time probably about 35 minutes south, I would say, right down Route 21. So if there was no ambulance in the village of Naples, you literally would be waiting for an ambulance for about 35, 40 minutes, depending on the weather. That's why having community-based ambulance bases and their ambulances is so important across the area. Without that, just think of your worst time or a true emergency waiting 35 or 40 minutes. Lives depend on an ambulance responding as fast as quick as possible and with the equipment needed.
Yeah. David, I want to throw this one over to you. What are some of the more common calls that you guys are seeing on a regular basis in your coverage area?
Primarily, we see a lot of falls, breathing problems, chest pain. Those are typically the three most common, especially with the aging population. When COVID hit, breathing problems raised and falls. It fell.
Yeah. There
wasn't anything distinct for any period of time, but those are the three common ones. They kind of fluctuate throughout the years.
Yeah. One of the things, and this was just sort of doing some research leading into this, I came across quite a bit on social media talking about the takeaway that's happening in terms of response for EMS being tied up with drug-related calls and incidents. Is there a higher number of those types of incidences today than there was 5, 6, 7 years ago? Or is it roughly the same? Because to your point, what you just mentioned, it seems like most of the calls are what you're describing, not as much the drug-related incidents, the overdoses or things like that.
I would say there hasn't been like a huge spike per se, but there's definitely a continuous growth.
Yeah.
With the Narcan being readily available over the counter, we see less and less fatal overdoses. But as drugs progress, they get harder and harder to combat. So people are, designing drugs that are caused to effectively not make our Narcan work.
Yeah.
So that challenge adds in, but I wouldn't say there's been a huge spike now. It's just been consistent.
In terms of that coverage area, you said that it's grown over the years, right? You're in Naples, you're in the western part of Ontario County. You're still providing mutual aid, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when one department is stressed a little bit, another may, and I'm sure it works both ways. Can you walk us through, both of you, sort of the operational challenge that poses? Because you don't know what that's going to look like day to day. You don't know what any call volume is going to look like day to day, but the uncertainty of not knowing when you might need to flex and help out perhaps towards Victor or maybe a little outside of your typical window. How much of a challenge is that in terms of navigating it day in, day out?
It's essential.
Yeah.
When we fall, they got to help us up. When they fall, we help them up. And that's the only way EMS is going to progress through the years.
Yeah.
Even though it's many different agencies, think of it like a unified team. We're all working for the same goal and helping others.
When folks see the challenges that a lot of, and I'm not talking about Ontario County here, a lot of other counties are dealing with response time as a major challenge, especially with some of the more, I'll call them longer shaped counties like Cayuga or Seneca County, where it might be a 40-ish minute drive from tip to tail, so to speak. When you think about that in Ontario County, is that something that you guys are paying like really close attention to, like in terms of having the resources in the right places to make sure that response time is consistent across the board?
I think it's something that we have always watched. I think it's also something that everybody should have always been watching. It should not be a new concept. It is something that I've been in EMS for about 30 years now. I knew it 30 years ago. When I see different regions having those situations and talking about how to handle their county, we have many EMS agencies, especially in Ontario County, between Phelps and Port Gibson, and Victor and Finger Lakes and Honeoye, along with Canandaigua, in Gorham and Shortsville. All of us together, we act as the county. We are the county, so we have all of our bases and we put resources where it's available, to where some of these places try to figure out a countywide program. Well, we are countywide. All the EMS agencies literally function side by side as a unified team. The cooperation that working together is so strong. That's what a lot of regions should take as an example. And I hope other regions do take that as an example to try to come together to work for the same goal.
I'm curious about the planning side of that. Is there a number? Is there like a time that is sort of aimed for by folks in that realm who say like, okay, we would like to be there on average from call time 15 minutes or 13 minutes or 17 minutes? Or is it a number that sort of varies depending on the exact location of the incident?
The number that I use personally, and I know some agencies use, is 15 minutes or less.
Okay.
Obviously, that differs from place to place,
Sure.
but think if you're out in a rural setting, 15 minutes is a very minute time compared to other places in the country, which are rural, which takes EMS over an hour to get to you. But 15 minutes or less is what I gather a rule of thumb. We try to do benchmarking, which is about 8 to 10 minutes. But 15 minutes or less is our goal, no matter what.
Is that what you sort of see as what should be the standard? Or is that when you came up through, is that sort of the standard that was instilled in you?
That was the standard that growing through all the years that was instilled in me. One of the variables that people forget, especially when they look at the time, is how we respond. Not every ambulance calls requires lights and sirens. Mm-hmm. So getting there within 8 minutes may not be the safest way to get there. It may not be a call that you need to get there in 8 minutes. We do a varied, different, unique calls from anywhere from a stub toe to can you help me off the floor? An ambulance is not going to respond lights and sirens for what we call alpha calls, which is very non-emergent calls. Yeah. So that time keeps adding up. When you start doing time in data research, that does affect your average time on scene. So we watch things very carefully.
Yeah. Yeah. And of course, obviously the response to, say, a car accident would be vastly different than a response to those types of incidents you're describing there. In terms of that, how much of a challenge is it conveying to people? Because I would assume that a lot of folks think, well, why can't you get from A to B in 10 minutes flat across the board? It's just here to here. But country roads, it's never a straight line. There's a lot of weaving in places where ambulances need to probably exercise a little more caution than, say, a small car does. How much of that plays into how you guys sort of plan the going to, especially when you're responding, December, January, February, March, when the weather can be a little suspect here?
Many times, especially during the winter or environmental, we will move ambulances on different locations. That way they can get a little bit quicker response. A lot of times what we've also done is work in cooperation very strongly with, especially on the western side, our fire departments for first responders, who their local community with first responders, CPR and first aid trained, and some of them have EMTs, actually first responded to patients. So they have somebody at their side initiating care before the ambulance even gets there. We found that to be a significant, huge help in saving lives and helping us get there safely.
Yeah. We were talking about staffing a little while ago in terms of paid versus volunteer. You rely on both. When you look at your team, how are you guys in the volunteer side of things? And when you look forward, is there a concern at all about folks aging out, or perhaps moving on to other things? Or do you feel pretty good about where your volunteer levels are right now?
We do have concern that there's not the younger generation coming in to fill in the ranks. Obviously, year by year goes by. Many of my volunteers are getting aging to a certain point to where EMS is hard work. It's hard work on the body, lifting and moving patients and rendering in care in all types of climate and weather. So we are concerned that the younger generation's not coming in as EMTs and medics and helping volunteer for their communities.
Is that potentially where the biggest pain point is in terms of the financial side of things moving forward, where there may be a need for more career staff down the line as those volunteer numbers continue to sort of dwindle over the years?
Absolutely. Each career staff is a significant cost. Unfortunately, it's, when I say significant cost, is not the income that they're bringing in for themselves. It's the insurance around them, and their training and everything that goes involved to have an employee. It's huge. I do know on the EMS side, that's getting quite concerning. And I know in talking to many of my neighbors stuff, even on the fire department side, it's a very large concern for them as well.
Yeah, it's interesting because one of the things we've had some conversations with Fastney and some volunteer fire departments over the last year and a half. And it's hard enough for them to get volunteers. And it seems like EMS is like 2 or 3 steps up the ladder in terms of difficulty, commitment, probably the training requirement. What is actually required out of volunteers who are volunteering to do EMS work instead of fire work?
So a lot of our volunteers specifically just drive the ambulance. They may not have an interest in getting any medical training whatsoever, but they do at least get CPR and AED certified and first aid certified. Personally, volunteering is where I got my start, and like a lot of my colleagues, that's kind of how we got started in EMS. And with volunteering kind of going down as time continues, it's harder and harder to see people start volunteering as their pathway. But when it comes to the training requirements, obviously, as the world goes on, we learn new things, and training requirements are going to go up. A lot of those are to enhance safety, new technologies. But for volunteers, typically they go through safety training, emergency vehicle operations. That way, they're able to go home safely. When it becomes time to become an EMT, then there's other certification classes. I think EMT class is up to 8 months now. And paramedic is 2 years or 18 months in most cases. And some people do it as a college degree.
Yeah.
It's interesting because a lot of people think that, an ambulance, they have that kind of stigma back in the day when they just put people in the back of an ambulance and drove them to the hospital.
Yeah.
And they don't realize that people are getting critical care treatment in the back of an ambulance these days.
Yeah.
And the cool thing is paramedic is not the ceiling anymore. There's critical care paramedic. There's flight medicine. There's so many different things that people can do in EMS. But unfortunately, we're still stuck with that old stigma of we just throw them in the back and drive them to the hospital.
Paint a picture for us, though, to that end.
Yeah.
Because I would imagine a lot more folks, unfortunately, wouldn't survive whatever it is they're going through if not for that critical care that they're receiving in the 10 or 15 or 20 minutes that they're in the ambulance until they get to the hospital.
Yeah, and with the new advancements as well, we work very closely with the American Heart Association, and there's a lot of metrics that they use to help increase patient outcomes and improve patient outcomes. If somebody goes into cardiac arrest or their heart completely stops, they have a good couple of minutes before irreversible damage starts. So with us getting there promptly, the first responders getting there promptly, the patient outcomes are becoming greater. With the new technology, we have things like automatic compression devices, so we're not physically doing the CPR anymore. And that's improving patient outcomes as well. So that 10% that they used to talk about of cardiac arrest survivors is actually slowly going up. And then the next step of that is if we take them to a local hospital when they need to get up to somewhere that's a cardiac center specifically. People, places like Canandaigua Emergency Squad, we have the ventilators, we have the medication pumps, things like that will get that patient who are still in a critical state from one hospital to another.
Yeah, really essential stuff. When it comes to recruiting, how do you guys approach it? What's the pitch? Like, what is the most effective method you guys have found over the years to get people to volunteer with something that requires 8+ months, a year, maybe 2 years of training, education to even be able to do it?
Honestly, word of mouth. That's usually nowadays where most EMS people start. They come in, they're interested. What's an ambulance do? What's an ambulance? What's the role of being on an ambulance? And that's where they usually will come in. They'll learn. They'll start driving. We teach them the emergency driving and all of those courses. And then they see all the good things that ambulances do for people. There's nothing greater than saving somebody's life. EMS is a hard field. We don't always get the outcome that we're hoping for, but many times we also get the outcome that we were really hoping for. And we watch people walk out of the hospitals who it was a scary moment at first, and now they see that and they get excited, and then they want to help more, and those are the individuals that usually want to continue becoming certified in New York State as an EMT or paramedic. They want to do more for their patients because it really is exciting helping somebody give birth to a baby and saving a life. The hardest part that we also run into, though, is the mental health part of it. Is we see people at their worst day, and there's things that sometimes people can't forget or get out of their heads. One of the things that helps draw people in EMS is having a good support structure. The EMTs and the staff, the volunteers in career, everybody supporting each other even through their worst times.
You read my mind because that was the next thing I wanted to talk about. Burnout, the prevalency of it. Is it as common as most folks would probably expect it to be in work that is, like you said, you're seeing people every day, most likely at their lowest moment? How prevalent is the burnout? How much of a challenge is that on the staffing side? And then, both your perspectives on what are some of the things that have allowed you guys to thrive in it and not, maybe be able to deal with some of the burnout or mental health challenges that come along with doing this work every day that have been most effective?
Well, I think probably the best thing is burnout is real. There was a time in in the world where people didn't believe in burnout. I think there was a time in the world where people didn't believe in PTSD to a fullest extent. It is real, where it does affect people differently and in many, many different forms. How we deal with it is being able to recognize when somebody needs help. Not only do we help others, one thing that EMS, and I can remember quite well, as even when I became a paramedic 20 some odd years ago, we were not very good at recognizing people when they were having PTSD or having issues from what they've seen and what they went through. Nowadays, we are very good at recognizing it, very good at getting them support, whether it's counseling services, whether it's talking, whether it's just being there in case they need somebody next to them. I think we've done tremendous in that aspect of understanding, recognizing, and supporting when it happens.
I think on the thriving aspect of it, in the 13 years I've been doing it, the one thing that always rings a bell is it's the toughest job you hate to love. I've been in many situations from bringing people into the world to watching them exit the world. But at the end of the day, when you see somebody that you made an impact on, it may not be the person that you restarted their heart. It may be the little lady you picked up off the floor and you just made her smile. People don't realize the small things in this job sometimes mean the most. And I always, my partners will always hear me say, if I made the patient smile, at least I did my job. And I think that right there, taking the positivity out of somebody's worst day, in a weird way, it makes a lot different, big difference in our opinion or in our profession.
How important is the network of other professionals who have experienced the same thing? Because every day, we're running stories about fatal car accidents, fatal house fire, all sorts of things, and every time, especially in light of a lot of these conversations, every time I see one of those press releases come through, I think to myself, well, there were probably a dozen volunteers on that scene who saw that, and that perspective has stuck with me because it's interesting, because to your point that you both are making here, that a network is really important, but a network of people who have experienced it is probably more valuable than just a network of people who say, I understand, or I empathize with what you're going through, right?
The network doesn't necessarily just stop at the agency itself. I personally have had many connections with the hospital staff, with fire departments, police officers. And sometimes when you just go through a really bad call, the first person that recognizes it may be the nurse you just gave a report to. And they pull you aside and say, are you all right? Even just that one action can make the difference between having a really horrible result or horrible end of the day to making a difference and saying, okay, well, people are at least looking out for me. And I think a lot of our crews see that as well. Not saying we don't do that internally. Of course, we always have a support system internally. On bad calls, usually when I was on the road more, if I had a bad cardiac arrest or something, I knew Matt and the other chief were going to be either pulling up on scene or shortly after. So there's always a good network of support, no matter really where you go in EMS that I've seen. It just may not be as visible sometimes.
Yeah. Anything you want to add there?
No, I think he hit the nail right on the head. The support is so crucial. And we have so many good resources between the county and other departments and other entities like the fire and police and each other. I think it's amazing the kind of support that people need. And honestly, I'll be so bold to say I think it's actually saved a lot of providers' lives because of that support.
Yeah. Well, and to that end, it probably worked toward helping the retention side of the staffing challenges that you guys are facing, where if it didn't exist, some of the staffing challenges and volunteer challenges that you guys see would be worse, right?
Yeah, I think people overlook the support thing so much. But a great example that I have, and it's something I always keep worrying about in the back of my mind, and make sure I put support in the forefront, that even overall my experience and all my years around New York State, I've had about 4 different friends, actually, unfortunately, providers commit suicide because of the stress of the job, to where I am now, and the support team that we have, and in this county, I'm actually glad to say that I haven't had to have that situation in quite a long time. So that's what I mean by, I really think the support structure that we have really does save lives, because 20 some odd years ago, I think it would have helped probably those 4 people.
Yeah, of course. Obviously heavy stuff. We've been talking about a lot of the challenges that you guys are dealing with. I want to end on a positive note. What's one thing that you guys see as, I guess a beacon, a shining light, or something that gives you some reassurance about the future of the work you guys are doing every day?
I think the beacon of light is being there to help others. I know it sounds funny that people would say, well, how can that be a beacon of light? The more I watch the world as of late, people coming together to help others, I really think is a foundation on how things can be better, whether it's on an ambulance or just out in the community. It's helping others. I don't think there's any better achievement and any better feeling than that.
And I think onto that end too, it's the providers, being there and seeing those really hard days, and, they're tired, but they still come back. And I think that's, very noble. I've seen crews that have gone 2 days with really busy shifts, and sure, it's tough, but they come back and they still support each other the best they can, and take care of the community.
For folks who would be interested in volunteering, helping out, learning how they can support what you guys do, what's the best way to get connected with Canandaigua Emergency Squad? Is it online? Is it a specific outreach? What's the best method?
We're both on Facebook, and there is a website. It's volunteer.canandaiguaes.org. And that'll take them to a link that kind of describes a little bit about the job, but also to get an application, or to reach out to me to talk about, what their interests are. Awesome.
David, Matt, thank you both for coming in today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for watching and listening to this episode of Inside the FLX. Check the show notes for links to everything we discussed today. And remember, new episodes of the show drop every Monday on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and the iHeartRadio app. If you have a question or a suggestion for a future episode, email news@fingerlakes1.com and download the fingerlakes1.com app for the latest breaking news. For the entire team here, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.